Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Hello and good evening from Karachi, Pakistan. My name is Dr. Shamil Khan, a consultant psychiatrist based in Karachi and one of the founding members of the Balance Pakistan initiative. Joining us today is our esteemed guest speaker, Dr. Muzaffar Hussain, who is also on the advisory executive panel of Balance Pakistan. Here, I would also like to acknowledge other founding members of Balance Pakistan, including Alia Mia, Atia Naqvi, Bina Yusuf, Imran Zafar, Dr. Humaira Saeed, Dr. Faisal Sheikh, Dr. Aisha Sanobar, and Dr. Aisha Mia. I would also like to acknowledge the sheer hard work of one of our medical students, Dr. Maria Khan, who is a third year medical student at AKU and has played a pivotal role in terms of organizing this event. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you all to the first session of Insights Academic Series, which has been started under the flagship of Ballant Pakistan. So I'll say a few things about the Insights Academic Series as well as Ballant, and then I'll hand over to Dr. Muzaffar Hussain. Through this academic series, we wish to generate interest in psychodynamic thinking within the community of healthcare professionals who have to deal with a range of socio-cultural complexities during the process of providing care, treatment, and helping the most vulnerable in the communities or in hospitals. We as clinicians attend not only to symptoms of patients, but also engage with the fabric of life of our patients, of which symptoms are often only a superficial part of. Through this academic series, we wish to not only generate interest in psychodynamic or psychoanalytical thinking, but also focus on the burden of providing care that doctors, nurses, psychologists, therapists, as well as other healthcare professionals have to deal with in their day to day clinical work, and how we can help them process that psychological burden using Ballant groups. So, a little about Ballant groups. These are groups of healthcare professionals who meet on a regular basis to discuss cases where a particular patient case or an encounter might have left them emotionally triggered, evoked, stirred up, or perplexed. Such emotional triggers can be both positive or ambiguous in nature. Balance groups become that platform where healthcare professionals can come together to discuss the relational aspects of their work in a safe and confidential setting. The effects of Balance group can be quite therapeutic on its own. As members, it helps the members in developing self-awareness, as well as it can reduce the risk of burnout or compassion fatigue. But rather than talking more about Ballant groups, I think it is important to focus on the subject of our guest speaker today. We do hope to have a separate session on Ballant groups in March or in April. And if people are interested in becoming a regular participant of this academic series, then they can actually express their interest to Maria at the end of the session through email. So for today, I have our esteemed guest speaker, Dr. Muzaffar Hussain, to talk to us about a subject that is so important both within a clinical context, i.e. in the consulting room, as well as it makes us think about the reality of virtual connections and their role or place in our contemporary social ecosystems. Dr. Muzaffar Hussain is a psychoanalyst and a consultant forensic psychiatrist. He's based in the United Kingdom and he works at the Portman Clinic, the Kent Forensic Psychiatric Service, and in private practice. Dr. Hussain has extensive experience in working psychoanalytically with mentally disordered offenders across the secure inpatient as well as outpatient settings. He specializes in the treatment of individuals with sexually deviant and violent predispositions. He conducts risk assessments and dangerous reviews of offenders for the criminal courts, the prison service, and the payroll board. Dr. Hussain has also worked in Pakistan with Professor Haroon Ahmed in relation to the introduction of mental health legislation, the Sin Health Act of 2013 for the protection of mentally ill patients in Pakistan. He has also worked in Karachi Central Prison at the behest of the Prisons Oversight Committee. And as I have highlighted before, he's also serving as an advisor on the Balanced Strategy Group in Pakistan. So just before I hand over the platform to Dr. Muzaffar Hussain, some Zoom keeping rules, which we all need to be mindful of. We have an hour for Dr. Hussein's talk, followed by a question answer session in which I will signpost the questions from the audience to Dr. Hussein's attention. We hope that we should be able to finish by 5:45 p.m. I would request all the participants to please not record the session or take any pictures. This session will be recorded by the administrators and made available to public following a screening so that confidentiality of any clinical material is not being compromised. Participants can write their questions in the chat box with their name and if they wish to share their professional background. If there are questions which may be similar to each other, then I'll try to summarize the theme and acknowledge names of the participants in order to save time. Please do fill in the feedback forms following the session as this would help us improve future sessions of Insight Academic Series. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Dr. Muzaffar Hussain so that he could enlighten us with his insights on a very important, pertinent, and significant subject. Thanks, Dr. Muzaffar.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Shamil. And thank you, everyone, for taking time out of a very busy Saturday to dwell on such a dark subject. I hope by the end of it, you will begin to have some degree of compassion and understanding for this very troubled group of patients who I'm sure you will be finding in your consulting rooms as well. This online living is a phenomenon which has touched the world over. So, okay, let me share the screen. Okay. Can everyone see this? Okay. Right. I'd like to begin the few slides that I have, and I think the slides serve as a talking point really to help us think about this very complex subject. And I would really hope that you can bring questions and your own thoughts about this in the discussion section. I've borrowed the title of this presentation, The Wasteland, from the poet T.S. Eliot. This is his very famous poem, and it starts like this. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. The idea behind including this stanza in this presentation is that it highlights the conflict between contrasts, which is a feature of online perversions. So breeding flowers out of the dead land. The land is dead, and how difficult it is to breed flowers from a dead land. Mixing memory with desire, which is ever present, and stirring dull roots, roots which are withered and which are pale with spring rain. The contrasts and how difficult it is and how cruel it is to live in a world of contrasts. And that is the world of online living for these particular group of patients. Now, I think there is some irony which might not be lost on a lot of you of me addressing this entire webinar online. And here I am talking about online perversions. The reality is that for the majority of us, online living is a phenomenon which we have embraced. I think it's been a revolution over the last 10, 15 years, largely because of the wide availability of mobile phones, a very real aspect of our lives. Internet connectivity, which is pretty global, broadband, increasing availability of virtual platforms, the interconnectedness of the world now, trading-wise. There's a reason why COVID spread as it did now in a way that the Spanish flu didn't spread or the plague in the Middle Ages didn't spread. It was instantaneous because we are a much more interconnected world. And of course, the lockdowns in much of the Western world have created another impetus for people to launch into an online way of relating. It is a catalyst, but one has to admit that we were already on this journey for a long time. Social media over the last 10, 15 years has made enormous inroads into our social lives. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, WhatsApp, We prefer images of ourselves, put up pictures of ourselves on social media, convey our achievements, look for admiration, look at stoking envy. Um, the things that previously used to happen in living rooms and social gatherings and weddings now happen on social media. Um, it is an increasing phenomenon, certainly in the West, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's emerging in Pakistan as well. The phenomenon of meeting other people online, online dating, online gaming. The point of all of these encounters is that it has brought internet and virtual existence into our relational sphere. And in our relational sphere, I think it taps into our own vulnerabilities and our own strengths in the same way that relationships used to tax us previously, before the internet. And it's created lots of issues, lots of conflict over morality. What is moral, what is immoral, what is appropriate, what is inappropriate, but also what is legal and what is illegal. Because with this emerging digital footprint, um, criminal justice services the world over, police the world over, have also cottoned on and are also constantly evolving with the social media, with the internet. Um, internet virtual profiles offer illusions of anonymity or grandiosity. It takes very little to present oneself as much larger than one is when you're doing it virtually. At the same time, for people who are terrified of themselves and of who they are and of the world, it presents a unique opportunity to present oneself anonymously, and yet have an influence on things. Now, when we are talking about online perversions, I just want to say that, this represents a small, perhaps increasing number of people from the larger group of people who are engaged in online living. So it doesn't, this talk is not about everyone. Although you may begin to see trends in what is ordinarily considered normal behavior as well, which, if taken to an extreme, may fall into this. Uh, when I think of online perversions, I think of issues that some of our patients may bring to our consulting rooms, such as compulsive use of pornography, which can be adult pornography as well as child pornography, stalking, voyeurism, trolling. But these are just a few examples of what is an increasing um, range of issues which will be brought to our consulting rooms in relation to online living. Now, pornography, say, is not new to us. The seductions of pornography are not new to this age. Now, this is a wonderful painting by the Italian artist Botticelli. It's The Birth of Venus. Painted it in the 15th century, late 15th century, and it's one of the masterpieces of Renaissance art. And at that time, even, this painting, painted out of fantasy, the Italian artist's fantasy of what the birth of the mythical goddess Venus might look like, had sexual overtones. This is a sexual expression. But what is it? It requires it required the artist in the first place to have a fantasy of what a sensual Venus might look like. It requires us as viewers to trace that sexuality in the figure of Venus. And in admiring her, it requires us to do some work in trying to trace the history of Venus and trying to admire the surroundings of this glorious Venus and so on. Now, I couldn't put to you in this talk some of the images of contemporary pornography, but how different they might be from something like this. And that's the point. Our current intrusive pornographic images, which are a part of this online existence in the last 15 years, say, represent a very different mode of expressing sexuality than this. They are vivid, they are intrusive, they offer a very direct visual image. And I wonder whether they have taken the place of more healthy fantasy structures which were there in the mind, but which are now progressively being colonized by these vivid images which are constantly bombarded at us. Now, people have thought a lot about how online living actually interacts with human development. So, how is it? What does online living do to promote, arrest human development? So, there are three broad explanatory models, and actually, the jury is still out. The first model is that online living or online perverse behaviors, such as compulsive use of pornography, child pornography, and so on, it detects the presence of already pre existing underlying perverse vulnerabilities, which would otherwise have gone unnoticed. So people would have carried on living despite having fantasies of um, being attracted to children. They would have gone on living had they not found these community groups, these images online, for example. Um, or is it the case that online living finds these vulnerabilities and then fixes them? Because the alternative gratifications which are available to us in the outside world, in the form of um usual boring relationships, in the form of usual boring work, and the mediocrity of existence, can never offer something as exciting or titillating as what this online existence offers? Or is it the more sinister explanation that online living actually enables and catalyzes, or so it promotes perverse modes of behavior? That it is something that makes us more unwell than we would be otherwise. Now, the jury is out because one cannot quite conduct a randomized controlled trial about something like this. Um, Although I suspect if you have, well, yes, no, it would be very difficult to do that now. I mean, the world is interconnected. Um, Now, perversions in psychoanalytic thinking um, are defined in two broad ways. There is a wider definition of perversions, which is a more, which is basically a reflection of any distortion from an adult genital mode of relating to others. And what I mean by genital, and I'll do ask me in the end, because I mean, I want to describe these concepts. Genital means, in analytic sense, a mature way of relating which relies sexually on intercourse, or largely heterosexual intercourse, um, as a mode of acquiring gratification sexually. So any distortion from that would represent an aspect of perversion. That would be the wider definition. The narrow definition of perversion is what was preferred by Freud. Freud's key insight, and it was not entirely his insight, but he's the one who elaborated it, was when he squashed the myth of infantile innocence in sexual terms. So Freud believed, and it was later observed, that we are all born as sexual beings. In fact, Freud would say we are born with two sets of instincts: sexual instincts and aggressive instincts. But if you're following the sexual instincts, that the infant is very much a sexual human being. And there is a course of development for the sexual instinct, which he described in different stages. There is the oral stage related to the mouth, the anal stage related to the anus, the phallic stage related to the phallus, and then after the Oedipus complex in adult life, the genital stage of sexual development. And each stage has its own characteristics, has its own fantasies, has its own preoccupations. And in Freud's view, the sum total of this sexual development was that there were various stages that one had to surmount. And under stress, the human psyche was vulnerable to regression to these earlier stages of sexual development. Um, and if one might conceive online living, online pressures of peer groups, online availability of images, pornography, as one such stressor, which may tax adult sexual adaptation, which has always been fragile, to regress to these earlier modes of being. Now, this slide is about sexual fantasy, but earlier on, when I was showing you Botticelli, I think it is a very relevant question, and I would really be interested in hearing your views about this. But how much of sexual fantasy do we have now, really? How much is left of fantasy? Um, and how much of fantasy has now been replaced by images, pictorial images, photographic images? In the traditional understanding of fantasy, fantasy emerges in its conscious form in adolescence, in daydreaming. And daydreaming of adolescence is characterized by, basically wish fulfillment, fantasies of various deprivations of having power, success, romantic success, fame, popularity, things that the adolescent craves but cannot have and is confused about. And very much in adolescence, due to puberty, it is linked to sexual excitement as well, and that is the emergence of sexual fantasy. Fantasy, in ordinary terms, in normal terms, is adaptive. So for the boy who wants to approach the girl in a romantic setting, the rehearsal of how it would be when he would go and speak to her in an awkward way is a very important prelude to him actually being able to do it. And that is adaptive, that is developmental. But in some cases, it can function as a fixation in the sense that it becomes repetitive, the same theme becomes enshrined, cocooned, and it is punctuated at the end by a masturbatory experience, which discharges the energy within it only for it to repeat itself again and again. And you can already see that it is becoming it's becoming part of the fixed furniture of the mind. Fantasy can also be a defense to action. So, say the feared or desired consequences of approaching that girl are so terrifying. So, the fear might be terrifying, or the desire might be terrifying. Fear might be humiliation. The desire might be, what if she says yes? If she says yes, it might mean actual exchange, actual intimacy, actual intercourse, and that might be terrifying given the disturbance of adolescence. So the fantasy may then function as a refuge from that entire situation and become a defense to action. And perverse online living, then, if we're looking at formulating it in these terms, becomes an elaboration and sharing of this staccato, stuck, repetitive, masturbatory sexual fantasy with others who might be arrested at similar stages. Um, and it leaves a psychic as well as virtual footprint. And the psychic footprint, I think, becomes more than a footprint. I think it becomes part of the fixed furniture of the mind. Now, I've got a few slides here about clinical assessment because I'm aware that a lot of you might be seeing patients like this. One of the first things that I think is important before we look at this slide is what motivates this person, this patient, to come into your consulting room. Where is the motivation coming from? That is the first assessment that one needs to make. Is the patient coming to you because someone else has sent them there? So is the conflict that the patient has over this online perversion a conflict between that person and some other person? Say it's that person's wife who said, I won't have enough. I mean, this is enough. You need to go get some treatment. Say it's that person's father, mother, children. There's been an expose. Everyone knows humiliation. Go get some treatment. So that person comes into your consulting room at someone else's behest. That is one kind of motivation. Less hopeful for engagement. Second kind of motivation is when the same conflict has been happening, but that person who walks into your consulting room has internalized some of those concerns. So they will say something like, yes, my wife thinks that this is a big problem and she said that she will leave me if I continue spending half my day viewing porn. But I think it's a problem as well because I've been watching the same themes for the last 20 years and there needs to be something that is going on. So there you have a bit of an internalization of what was in the first case an external conflict. The third kind of conflict is the most promising in terms of treatment, which is where the person has fully internalized the two parts of himself, perhaps, that are struggling and that are dissonant with each other. When I'm using CBT language, but there's an internal dissonance now between the part of them that wants to do this and another part of them that doesn't want to do this and that wants to understand and address the issue. Usually, clinically, the distinctions are not as sharp as this. One is always on a journey. And it might be the task of assessment and initial treatment to get the patient to move from the second to the third. Much more difficult to move from the first to the second, but it is possible. I think when you're faced with such a patient who's had, in effect, and this is a very important thing to remember, who's lived two lives. These patients live two lives. One life is a life they live with everyone else. So, with their family, in a network of relatives, or with their spouses and their children, that is their outward life. But then they've also been living in an inward life. This is their secret life. And it has required a fair degree of deception and hiding for them to get there. And they've been probably been carrying on with it for a long time. Um, Now they're bringing this to you. I think it's always a good idea for them to be offered some compassionate questions, not in an inquisitorial way, not in a cross examination, but from a place of trying to understand their experiences, of getting precise details of what it is that they do. What is it that they've done? What are the images that they see? What are these people? Who are these people that they see? Are these men, women? Are these children? Are these adults? Is there a particular theme? Incest is terribly common. Incest themes are terribly common. I'm looking at, I'm thinking of mother-child, mother-son, father-daughter, brother-sister themes. Is it, when are they accessed? What's the timeline? And alongside a lot of this behavior, there is often the case that there are online chat rooms where these fantasies, which have now become concretized in these pornographic images, are then nourished and shared and play acted and role played. And what are the underlying fantasies? Now, asking such a patient who's been hiding all of this for a long time, often they find it a relief to be able to finally talk about them. I'll tell you a little bit more about examination and risk assessment. Now, the method of the initial assessment is, I'm afraid, the usual routine method which any good clinician would have, which is to get a good compassionate history from this person. And you will begin to see the themes, and your formulation about this patient will emerge as you are listening to their life narrative. So, family history for me is essential. Okay. I mean, not just because I'm an analyst, but because I think that is the way it is, isn't it? Um, it's very interesting to see the particular characteristics of parents that such patients have. Fathers generally tend to be emotionally unavailable and sometimes unpredictable, largely impotent in the family home. That is a remarkable feature. Impotent in the sense of the home is ruled by the mother, who tends to be assertive, perhaps over intrusive, but is the dominant parent. Sometimes there's also a precocious exposure of the child to the parent's sexuality. Um, Father's pornography, we found that to be such a common theme. So the child's introduction to pornographic online existence is actually a legacy of him having discovered father's hidden pornographic collection somewhere, or father's disturbed over masculine sexuality, perhaps due to father's own conflicts. Uh, Mothers may also be, so I've described mothers being over intrusive. Mothers can also be depressed, so they are unavailable. Then there's the interplay of siblings in the family home. There's a lot of seduction between siblings. Um, Personal history. Um, Generally, such patients tend to be intellectually overdeveloped. I don't know if some of you may be familiar with the work of Anna Freud, who was Sigmund Freud's daughter. And she did a lot of work on developmental lines. She was quite keen on child analysis and child development. And one of the themes she developed was how, in order to compensate for a certain developmental line, the developing child adolescent compensates and overcompensates along another development. So, such individuals, for example, overcompensate intellectually in order to deal with their emotional and sexual handicaps. So they do well at school. They may be bullied, they may be pushed to the outside of social groups, um, and they may try to find a space within these social groups in line with what is already their evolving online perversion. So, for example, I've met some patients who tell me that during college years or school years, they were known as the the custodian of the best pornography you could find in the group, in that social group. And they acquired a certain reputation in their peer group for being the ones everyone could come to for the best or for the most cataloged pornography collection. And you can already see that the developing adolescent is using whatever resources it has in the presence of unbearable and difficult sexual problems to get some self esteem. But you can see it's becoming part of the permanent furniture. Sexual interest in masturbation. Always ask, I think. Um, Education, I've told you about. Occupation, in some cases, some of these patients do very well. They may go on to acquire senior positions in academia, in finance, um, also in the health, in the helping professions, teachers, doctors, nurses. Um, Often their success is propelled by the grandiose belief in themselves, which is a natural outcrop of their hidden lives. Because they feel so triumphant at having hidden this second life from everyone else, they are able to use that and project that into their outside life, and and basically seduce people into believing that they're much better than who they are. Relationships generally tend to be stunted, but that is hidden. Stunted in the sense of they'll be married, they'll maybe even have children, but they will function as the baby in the family, will function at more infantile, primitive levels than the adult genital levels. And often you will find that during the course of their treatment, and this might take some years, uh, you will find the transition in from the infant patient into a father patient, and that is very heartwarming actually if you're able to track that. It's as if the patient begins to discover that there is also a father in him, even though he's got children who are now in their 20s. But there is a lot of grief and mourning to undergo then because of the time that has been lost. Alcohol and drugs often play an issue. Personality, I think it's always a good idea to probe for particular aspects, but I think already if you're taking a good history, you'll already get an idea of where this person lies in the personality domains. Medical and psychiatric problems and offending history. Uh, I won't tell you what's obvious. I mean, the whole idea of major mental illnesses and diagnoses and so on. This particular group of patients, because we're talking about perversions, I'm already thinking that the major mental disorders, schizophrenia, delusional disorder, and so on, are excluded. But you might have secondary depression, but that might well be something that you can work with rather than send them to Dr. Shamil for treatment. Um, so, offending history is more relevant here than over there. Now, these perversions, I mean, it's interesting once you get a lay of the land. So, someone has come to you with these set of problems to do with online living, a borrowed hidden life. There's been an expose, families found out, they've brought him in, or he's come in, wife has brought him in, or something like that. Then it's important to understand what might be motivating this. Now, often it is the case that online perversions function as antidepressants. They're pick me ups. So the mental state just before their use is one of depression and utter loneliness and despair. Um, Loneliness is a very powerful word, and I want you to remember that. You see, loneliness for me sits right next to the wasteland. Um, and a lot of these patients are terribly lonely. Um, Online perversions pick you up. Now, in some cases, internet sexual experience, online perversions can also be a defiance and rebellion. So I can imagine, and I've seen patients from female patients, from conservative families, religious conservative families, where the hidden life of this patient will be surreptitious the exposure of herself on webcams, and looking for attention by exposing herself, her genitals, her breasts on webcam in defiance and rebellion against the claustrophobic, religious, conservative atmosphere in the family home. But you need to understand that might also be motivating this. Uh, Internet sex can also be a continuation of childhood sexual experiences. As I mentioned, a father's porn, which has disturbed, excited, and disturbed this developing child. Internet sex can also be, I think, and this is a very important one, a titrated exposure to one's own sexuality, which one is actually terrified by. I think it is underreported at how terrifying adolescence can be for the adolescent, how disturbing that time can be. when the body's changing. For the boy, the genitals are growing in size, the voice is cracking. For the woman, menstruation, breast growth. It is a terrifying time. And internet sex can offer a titrated sort of a lower dose of the same disturbance by funneling it in an online, more manageable way, which is where it is disembodied. The core complex is something which is an analytic idea which was first stated by Glasser, who was a psychoanalyst at the Portman Clinic some years ago. And Glasser viewed the core complex as a precursor of the Oedipus complex. Oedipus complex, famously written by Freud, formulated by Freud from Sophocles' play, Oedipus Rex, which is the boy's incestuous desire for the mother and the fear of the father. And core complex, though, is not a triad. So in the Oedipus complex, there's the child, there's the mother, there's the father. Core complex is much more to do with the infant and the mother, or the maternal object, as it's called in psychoanalysis. And it is the early tussle between the infant and the mother, basically. And Glasser formulated from analyzing adult, violent, and sexually deviant patients that a lot of their conflicts could be traced to very primitive conflicts of the baby with the mother. So the baby wants to merge with the mother because the mother is the provider of sustenance, of affection, of love, of attention. But in this merger, the developing infant also feared annihilation and therefore pushed against, pushed against violently. And but then when the infant pushed against this, then it feared abandonment. So it was caught in a yo-yo in this relationship with the mother. And the outcome of this conflict was generally some measure of control of the mother by crying at a certain pitch to get the mother close. But then the mother getting irritated that the baby is always crying. So the quietening down, but then crying again. It's that kind of moment to moment changes in the infant's mental state. I don't know, there's quite a tradition of infant observation in the trainings here, which I did as well. I don't know whether you've done infant observations. Perhaps you can observe some mother, baby, children from wider family, and you will see this kind of very delicate manipulation if you are able to observe closely of how the baby interacts with the mother. But anyway, Glasser formulated that it was this complex, this early complex, core complex, which happens to all of us, but in some cases, there is a developmental arrest and a forging of a controlling sadomasochistic relationship with one other object, which is the mother, in later times displaced onto other objects. And the primary aim of this relationship is control. And you need to remember that control is a big feature of these kind of patients. Control of what? Well, often the images that these patients watch on the screen are narcissistic objects. They are related to narcissistically, not as individuals in their own rights, but as extensions of themselves for the sake of their own gratification. They are related to as a projection of their own sexual fantasies and script lines. There is a complete disregard of the needs of the object, especially in the case of child pornography, where there is child abuse actually going on. These people don't see the abuse. They see a gratification of their own fantasies in these images. Pedophilia is a misnomer. It's referred to as child, it's not child love, it's child hate. And you need to understand, I think this is a very crucial part of working with these patients, that often when you're presented with desire, so they'll bring desire to you, they'll say, well, I desire this, so I get sexual attraction, gratification, arousal, and masturbation. It might give the illusion that it is coming out of place of love. It isn't. It is coming out of a place of hate. It is actually an expression of aggression. Aggression and control. For example, rape. We're not discussing rape today. Very, very different topic. We can have another webinar on that. It is rarely about love, rarely about desire. It's almost entirely about aggression, control, and vengeance. Vengeance is a very the wasteland. Now, countertransference has to be taken together with the transference. The transference of these patients, and the biggest, will be those people. A transference, if I can define it, is the recrudescence of those infantile relationships that one had towards one caregivers, but that are now displaced onto the therapist. Okay, so it's the template of relating that we had with our caregivers, which which are early caregivers, which are now displaced onto the therapist. In this case, we've already seen what the caregivers were like. They were either over intrusive. Okay, so we run the risk of being inquisitorial. Why are you doing this? When did you do this? You need to be locked away forever. Okay, or they were too indulgent. We can collude with such patients, uh, you know, pseudo normalize them. That yes, this is a bit of what everyone does. And those are the main pitfalls of countertransference. But the third one, which is, I mean, if you're aware of these two pitfalls, the third one, which in these cases, which long term burrowed lives hidden away from society, what they'll bring to you is the deadness of that world. Going back to T.S. Eliot, it's the deadness of that world. And they'll be trying to grow flowers out of that dead land. So it'll be sterility that you will feel. Boredom brings the same thing every week, sameness. And I think the challenge is to being able to sustain treatment under those conditions, because you have to feel those things in order for them to have some shared experience, will be to rely on the setting of the treatment, because they will challenge the setting of the treatment. They will challenge the boundaries, and you'll have to be constantly vigilant to enact for enactments. So when they'll push boundaries, they'll want to know more about you, get to know more about you. They will maybe start, thinking of you as those objects. Now, one theme I've put in there, which is quite a struggle for us. I don't know how many of you are seeing patients in person. A lot of people here are seeing patients on Zoom and on these visual platforms. And these visual platforms create challenges of their own. For example, some patients may adapt quite well to these visual platforms. They might find this a natural continuation of their online existence before. Um, Now, that very reason may actually make the treatment less effective, because we are trying to offer our patients, such patients especially who are scared of people, a wholesome experience, and for them to be able to relate to the whole of you rather than just a picture of you on their screen, because they're vulnerable to that. Now, I'll mention briefly these other kinds of online perversions only by way of mention, and maybe some of you will ask questions about it. Compulsive use of pornography, it's I'm talking a lot about pornography here, but the usual mental cycle is one of defiance. Then you use the pornography, then it's depression, regret, and repeat. Stalking is another emerging issue, and I think this is another seminar on its own. Um, Online existence can be a way to for the rejected stalker. So there's a breakdown of a relationship, and the rejected stalker is unable or unwilling to accept this breakdown, an opportunity to stalk first people. Incompetent stalkers, people who have never been able to approach others, may use online existence to keep tabs on others. Intimacy seekers, more delusional intimacy seekers, anonymous individuals stalking celebrities. Predatory stalkers are probably the most dangerous, who would use online existence to actually track down and actually physically confront the person they're stalking. Voyeurism, I think voyeurism is another emerging form of online perversion, which is secret filming. And I've I have a few of such patients in treatment. Um, in such cases, generally the conflict is related to, again, what I mentioned a bit earlier about the primal scene, about the child spying on the mother in some way and feeling so terrified of what they see that they are reduced to a distance, and but they get disturbed and excited by it as well, and they wish to retain some level of control of the object. Again, desire seduction on the one hand, but control, aggression on the other, because violating someone's privacy by filming them secretly is a way of controlling them and being able to view them whenever one wants, not when they want, but when one wants. And that is the key thing about voyeurism. Trolling, which is another common thing. These trolls haven't come into treatment, but I've seen them for the courts. Um, the reason they don't come into treatment is because trolls, and I hope you know what trolls are, who trolls are, but I don't mean the Scandinavian gremlins. I mean online trolls. Um, they are so terrified of others that they rarely are able to tolerate another person in the room offering them help. They get identified by the courts when they've been too troublesome, and they get sent for assessments and risk assessments. I've generally found them to be very terrified individuals who have resorted to trolling because it's anonymous. It allows them to express packets of hate and aggression in packs. So they crave a lot of group security because they're actually terrified being alone. And usually, the image of the troll from what their online profile is, there's a big discrepancy between the two. Now, this is my last slide. This is, of course, voyeurism in the Renaissance. You can see I'm a fan of the Renaissance. Uh, this is Titian, the Venetian painter, and this is the hunter, Actaeon, coming upon the queen of hunting, Diana, while she's bathing with her friends. And you can see that he alights upon her, and she's shocked, and he is triumphant. Um, of course, there's a second painting in this series where she hunts him down and kills him. Um, of course, the voyeur, our contemporary voyeur on online, engaged in an online perversion, escapes that fate of being hunted down. But maybe that is why he prefers, or he or she prefers, an online existence. I'll stop there, Shamil, and let's see if the audience has any questions. We can't hear you, Shamil.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Dr. Muzaffar, for such an informative as well as a thought-evoking presentation. Deconstructing analytical ideas is such a complex task, but you have done it with so much of a grace, and you've always done that with a similar grace in the past. I mean, the way you have emulsified them and you have sort of like paired them with clinical examples, it makes it relatively easier to grasp hold of a subject which is both dark as well as very ambiguous in nature. So I'll probably start off maybe a question from my own end, and then we'll continue with the discussion by bringing up the questions from the floor. So my question is in relation to the countertransference, Dr. Muzaffar. I mean, when you work with these patients, these are very complex patients, and they can actually evoke or provoke quite strong mixed feelings. And you said something about the countertransference, that there is often a subjective element to it as well as an objective element to it. How do you sort of like process all those feelings when you work with patients with sexually deviant behaviors? I mean, that kind of the emotional baggage of working closely with such patients.
Shamil, that is a very important question. And I think this kind of work is harrowing. There is no two ways about that. I think this kind of work is not the kind of work that one would engage in as a surgeon, for example, where you conduct a piece of surgery and you go home and the surgery is finished. You might get a call from the nurse, but that's it. You take some of this baggage with you, because not only have these patients done things which are difficult to normalize, but their backgrounds are also fraught with tremendous trauma and tremendous adversity. Okay, so what they've done is a natural outcome of the life that they've lived. Now, absolutely right. I think the countertransference, subjectively, countertransference, I understand it as the usual ups and downs of my mediocre life, the troubles that one has to undergo from this person and that person. And then it is the objective countertransference that one has to be sensitive to in order to receive what the patient is communicating. And what they will be communicating, what they will be projecting in their transference will be those same figures who they related with earlier on. So they'll be projecting the stern, intrusive mother. You did this, you did that, come on, get on with it. They'll be projecting the imagined, colluding father. This is my porn. You can watch it, I can watch it, it's okay. So those are the two main threats. Now, I think self-awareness is extremely important. You mentioned, Shakil, about the Pakistan initiative. I think Balanced groups offer a unique opportunity for all clinicians to sit with themselves a little bit. I think that is very important, because when you sit with yourself, you're able to follow your own thoughts a bit better. And I think when you're able to follow your own thoughts, you can then, your own feelings as they arise, then you can keep with the process. The third thing, though, which is the wasteland, is also relevant, because these patients are repetitive patients. They do the same thing again and again. And that can leave you, and change when it happens is very slow. And that can often leave you feeling very exhausted and very bored and very emotionally dulled. So those are the sort of main sort of features.
Okay, thank you. I'll now ask you a couple of questions which are coming from the floor.
Hmm?
So there is one question which I think is quite an interesting one from the moral or the ethical perspective. The question is that, do you think that by tracing the predatory behavior to one's childhood, we are actually victimizing the abusers and predators and giving them an excuse for such behavior instead of making them accountable for their actions?
I think the key thing in that, Shamil, what I'd say is they are accountable for their actions. You see, I think as healthcare providers, as clinicians, we receive these patients after they've been made accountable.
Hmm.
And that is a very important thing to remember. When I mentioned about what is the motivation for treatment, I think this links into that. If this person is coming to you for a lenient excuse, face saving way out of a difficult situation, reject them. Okay? Because they're not there for that, you're not there for that, and you're not going to collude with them to do this. To say, it's okay, you did it, you had a bad childhood, you're a victim. The one key thing in these patients is that they are not just victims, they are victims as well as perpetrators.
Hmm.
And that the perpetrator part of them needs to be confronted, and you need to raise it, and you need to do it assertively and in a containing way. So it's not at all about providing some gratification to a victim narrative to give them an easy way out. In fact, we turn patients away who just
Hmm.
come in to talk about child sexual abuse, their own, as reasons why they abuse children. We turn them
Hmm.
away. It is not about that. It is about why you did this right now. But you can
Hmm.
do that. It's
Hmm.
not you can actually do that. Uh, Accountability, law enforcement, and the rest has to be completed. We are healthcare providers. We're not the custodians of the law and order. That I'm clear about.
So interesting, Dr. Muzaffar. I think that kind of like leaves me with a couple of more questions as well, but I just want to give the floor to the questions from the audience. So there is a question from Alia Mia. Does this relate to impulse control disorders in any way?
What I'd say, see, when we're looking at impulse control disorders, yes, in a way it does. But when you're looking at a fully formed perversion, that is usually more than an impulse control disorder. It is a fully fledged pattern of behavior which is repetitively engaged in for the purposes of sexual gratification. And yes, they will say they can't control their impulse, so therefore they repeat the whole script again. But I think it may bear more fruit to look at it as a full system, which will have its roots, by my view, which will have its roots in their early experiences. Um, and I think that is, I think that will be more helpful for treatment. Um in terms of understanding it as an impulse control disorder on its own, I you can define it as that, but diagnostically you might. But in terms of formulation, I don't see how it would advance the cause of understanding them.
Right. Okay, so the next question is from Ahmad Tahir. He asked that the one thing you mentioned that interested him, that you said was that these patients project confidence from their secret lives into their real lives by being able to deceive people. Are they aware of the dissonance between the two lives, or do they feel in a conflict in doing so? Or do they not have enough self-awareness to suffer internal conflict or cognitive dissonance?
I think that is absolutely right. I think that's a rhetorical question. Tahir, is it Tahir?
Ahmad
I,
Tahir, yes.
yeah, Ahmed Tahir, that is a rhetorical question. I think you're right. I think they do not have enough self awareness. That collapse is to come, I'm afraid, and it does come. Okay. I mean, and when it comes, they are devastated. It's a big fall, and they've gone in this way for a long time. No, they don't. They're not aware of their dissonance at all until it comes falling down. And yes, absolutely, the triumph of deception becomes translated into the triumph and grandiosity of their external lives.
Hmm.
And it's very interesting, it reminds me of this patient I have in treatment. Uh, After the collapse, so police prosecution, collapse, two lives have gone into one, everyone hates him, he lost everything, trying to build it up again. It is like going back onto a battlefield, honestly, when they have to slowly work their way to look at the ruins of their life. So everything that they've lived, which has been in this kind of deceptive two lives kind of way, they have to look over and grieve and lose all over again. That is a work in itself, the work of mourning. Um, Work of mourning a life that wasn't really lived, the work of mourning a life of not having really been a father to your children who are now in their 20s, of never having been a husband to your wife, um, of not really having been present in the home. Uh, that's a big task as well.
Hmm. Right. I think, Dr. Muzaffar, there are a couple of questions coming up regarding the prognosis, as well as some need for elaboration on accountability and turning them away. And I wonder if people are keen to know about the suitability for treatment,
Hmm.
as well as the prognosis. So yeah,
Yeah,
I think the questions are kind of like in that context, a couple of them.
look, I'll talk about suitability first and then I'll tell you about prognosis. Okay?
Hmm.
Suitability is extremely, it's an important question. And I mentioned about the motivation that for me as a clinician, that comes first. Okay? What is it that makes the patient walk into the consulting room? Is it someone else? Is it them? Is it only them? Okay? That's the first. The second is how long this problem has been going on for, and whether they're able to forge enough of a therapeutic alliance with you and they're able to trust you enough to be able to talk about themselves without wanting to deceive you. That's another thing, only to be found out in time. It's an issue here. I don't know whether it's an issue there. Drugs and alcohol. If the person has been resorting to the use of drugs and alcohol to either feed their grandiosity, keep it going, or to shield them from really facing the difficulties that they would have to face if they weren't drunk or addicted to something, um, that for me would also be something that would go against them. Um, what would go for them? I'm afraid a certain level of intelligence, not just intellectual but emotional, will go for them. Often, and this is, it takes time to know this as well. So, often an early experience that was not so bad is also important. So, say the childhood has been terrible, mother wasn't there or father wasn't there, and they were abused, this, that, and the other. If there is one person who they related with, where they remember the relationship as a bit more wholesome, that will be a bit more positive because you can build on that. I'm afraid people who live terrible childhoods end up with terrible lives. And if they are seeing you, that is, I don't mean everyone, if they're seeing you. And a lot of them cannot be helped. But if you're looking at those who can, often there is one person there who they've related with in a better way, who you can build on. Previous experiences of therapy is very important. If they're able to tolerate and sit with someone for a while, then they may be able to see you and get help from you. Lack of psychosis is very important. If they've got a history of a psychotic illness, then generally you can predict that as things get difficult, their reality testing will be tested and they will withdraw, and you might make them
Hmm.
worse. That's what I would say about suitability. Prognosis. I wish I had happier tidings for prognosis. My analytics supervisor was the director at the Portman Clinic for 20 years. And I asked him, I remember once, that if any of his patients had ever been cured. And he thought for a bit and he said, yes. I said, how many? He said, one and a half. Now, cure, the idea of looking at cure is a difficult one. I mean, I guess if you're looking at very basic mental disorders, I mean, how many of them are cured and how many of them become manageable? That's a moot point, isn't it? Of course, the traditional analytic view is that life is a question of being able to tolerate progressive disappointments without despairing at some level. I think you can help some of these patients to be able to understand themselves a bit better and to be able to tolerate the burden of their lives without repetitively resorting to these perversions, and perhaps take more ownership of those other roles that they also have, where they may be valued by people around them despite what they've done and despite who they are. That's another thing. So you might be able to veer towards a better compromise solution than what they have managed. I know that's not cure, but then very few things in life, I'm afraid, in our field, admit of a cure.
Hmm. True. Okay, so we have another question in relation to online perversion with females, and what is their pathology? Is it similar to that of men?
I have to be honest. I mean, I have female patients as well, but interestingly, not as many in outpatients as I have in inpatients. Um, Now, the female patients I have, it is the pathology in some respects is similar in the sense of the disturbed background. There is a lot more conflict with the mother in female patients, and a lot more control of the mother with female patients. There's a greater frequency of eating disorders with female patients. Um, Exhibitionism is the key online perversion with the female patients, as opposed to voyeurism or stalking, you might find, but exhibitionism would be the key one. And the patients I have generally, I mean, the one patient comes to mind, comes from a very staunch religious background where the exhibitionism is a method of defiance and rebellion against that against that situation.
Right.
Of course, the
So,
problem with exhibitionism, and just to complete that, Shamil, is that often what's found is female users of online perversions get prosecuted and less than male, because male offending online is more aggressive, it's more invasive, so that gets disproportionately illegalized as opposed to female behaviors which may be equally disturbing, but because it's not prosecuted, it's not identified as a problem socially, it doesn't come into your consulting room.
hmm. So, Dr. Muzaffar, I just want to ask a question from my end. I mean, we are talking about sexually deviant individuals who who you sort of like undertake treatment with. I mean, the context of Pakistan is that taking even a psychosexual history in a consulting room is such a complex task. And I can say that about my own experience of sort of working in UK and then coming to Pakistan. It took me a couple of months in just to kind of like ask the patient about premature ejaculation. And what I realized that the sexual lingo is so constipated and castrated in the consulting room
Mm.
that it becomes incredibly difficult to ask in detail about the psychosexual history. Also, the involvement of the family. Often, the families kind of like give no space to the individual
Yeah.
or the patient. So those are some of the challenges here. I think there is a sexual vocabulary which is extremely constipated, and then also superimposed on that. I mean, the role of Bollywood movies, for example. I mean, we are talking about all these kind of like the impact of the pornography, but as far as the Bollywood movies are concerned, and how they have sort of fantasized our sexual sort of like
Mm.
aspects of life. So there are quite a lot of patients who come to seek therapy with the profound premarital anxiety because
Mhm.
what they have been exposed to or what they have
That's right.
seen kind of like creates a whole sort of like a fabric of and a complex fabric of its own, and not being able to meet those fantasies which have been created
Mm.
kind of leads to all these profound anxieties, both in men as well as women. But more, I've seen a couple more men perhaps in the consulting room. So I just wanted to kind of like get your views, just to kind of like make the conversation a little bit more contextual
Mm.
as far as Pakistan is concerned.
I think one of the things um, that I'd say to that, Shamil, is, I mean, I think it's very important for us to be able to see patients on their own, and there may be tactful ways of uh, doing that. Because I absolutely agree with you, the intrusiveness of families, which is also the case here on some occasions, where they won't let go. In which case, it becomes very limited as to what you can or cannot talk about. Um, I think by and large, see, sexual matters have always been taboos, in every society and every culture. I suspect, though, that looking at the same online age that we are living in, that these issues are to some extent now have been globalized.
Hmm.
Sex, pornography use, I'm sure in Pakistan is not the in the last few trends. I'm sure pornography use in Pakistan is quite high. So people are using it, but they are averse to talking about it. I think there's a cultural element of, you know, will this sound right? Will it sound too intrusive? Will it sound too threatening? Will it sound too inappropriate? Will it sound too irreligious? Um, I think some of these issues have to be tackled, I suppose, in the self-reflection and perhaps in balanced groups, where one first has to evolve the vocabulary for yourself before one is able to use it, not in a not in a licentious way, not in a way of sort of finding out more in a sexually curious way, but in an understanding way. Um, and I totally agree about your points about the Bollywood movies, which is another reflection of pornographic activity. You see, because the burden of the expectations and fantasies which are produced, and the same sexual object becomes threatening. You see,
Hmm.
because and the performance anxiety of actually being able to keep up with that idealization which they have nourished and lived with. Uh, Maybe because that's they were always vulnerable in that way, and will be an issue. And I think what one will find is sometimes there are also couple problems in that. Shamil. That's another thing I didn't cover in this talk, but often such issues are a part of the couple dynamic. So, say you are having one individual who's been identified compulsive user pornography, sent to you, can you do something about it? And then very soon you realize, well, actually, it's something to do with the two of them, not just him. And it's become something between them. So, say the woman is sexually avoidant or she runs away from him every time he comes to her. And then he resorts to online pornography, he becomes the bad object, and then that's how they regulate their lives. Now, that means that the problem is not just in him, but it's in the relationship. So sometimes
Hmm.
these issues become subjects of couples work as well. We need to sort of
Hmm.
keep a broad mind about that.
Hmm. Right. So there's another question from Taimur Ahmed, um, and he wants to follow on from the question which Ahmed Tahir basically asked. And he's asking, have you ever observed these patients have problems of low self-esteem and reduced confidence instead of increased confidence? His thinking is that perhaps they are unable to deal with the failure of being unable to act on their fantasies and secret desires, thus they lack confidence. And what do you think?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think at the end of it, underlying all of the grandiose fantasies and even the achievements, there's a scared little boy who's never grown up and who's viewed things from a distance, is lacking in confidence, lacking confidence in his body, in his penis, in his identity. And that is absolutely the case. But I don't rush to that, by the way, technically. I don't rush to that interpretation when I'm working with these patients because we don't want to feed the victim narrative. You see, these things, the patient will very happily agree to this, by the way. Of course, I'm a scared little boy who's been shying and hiding away from everything and so on. But you need them to find it, and it's found in the work that you do with them rather than you delivering it to them. But I absolutely agree. They are like that. That is what causes them to be this way.
Right. So a couple of more questions, and then we'll go to the concluding comments. Dr. Muzaffar, one question from my end again. You said something about the countertransference, but I'm also thinking about the transference, which is another very important tool as
Mm.
far as psychoanalytic technique is concerned. So even with patients who don't have sexually deviant behaviors, when you start working with them, as far as therapy is concerned, you can see that they are kind of like going through different stages of their transition, or to say their stages of development. So the oral stage in which they are kind of actively exploring the therapist, and then the need for the control of the framework of the therapy, followed by the curiosity about the life of the therapist, which is the perfect kind of like the stage for the Oedipal scene.
Mm.
And then whether they can have a very mature or a genital relationship with the therapist. So with these patients, I mean, who are sexually deviant, in which in whom
Sorry, we lost your audio, Shamil.
can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now. Yeah.
Yeah. So in these patients who have sexually deviant behaviors, I mean, how important the transference actually becomes as a tool, and how does it sort of like interplay in the consulting room?
I think I can very clearly say that it's mostly oral and anal.
Okay.
And it's mostly about control and mostly about oral exploration. And I think these patients, therefore, their importance of the core complex as opposed to the Oedipal complex with perverted patients. Okay,
Hmm.
the neurotic patient, and it's interesting to think about, how is the neurosis different from a perversion. For neurotic patients, you will get those other levels, and hopefully, in due course, they will relate to you as an adult. And you might get more of the interest in yourself, with the curiosity. You may
Hmm.
get that. With some of these patients, they are not curious at all about you, because they're really arrested in the oral and the anal stage. And they think of you as a very threatening, large object who is so beyond them that he's threatening. So they won't even
Hmm.
feel brave enough to find out more about you in a lot of these cases. In fact,
Hmm.
all of the cases I have who are in treatment, they are less curious about you because they're so invested in those earlier stages.
Right. There's another question: to what an extent do traditional gender roles play a role in the prevalence of these perversions?
It's very interesting question. This is. There was an interesting study done in the 60s or the 70s about, there was a tradition, and I guess I can. How many participants? 29 participants. I'm making a self-disclosure to 29 participants. Uh, there was a tradition when I was little of dressing up uh, boy children as girl children. So I've seen some pictures of myself with, my mother's put, some what is it called? You know, she's dressed me in very nice, pretty clothes and this and that. Now, people have said, well, does that cause these gender confusions? Or do they accentuate the genders that you have? Okay. So dressing a boy as a girl, does it make the boy more boyish? Or does the boy under the impression of dressing as a girl become more girlish? And I think generally it depends on the interplay between the mind and the constitution you have and
Hmm.
the environment that you're faced with. And of course, your early childhood environment. For my patient, the one I presented, his, his mother dressing him up as a girl and relating to him as the dead daughter and caused him so much difficulty that he began to cross dress, became homosexual, this, that, and the other. Okay. In other cases, the same outcome may not happen. In other cases, that same boy who's sort of teased at being a girl and so on may become a much more reasonably adjusted man. Uh, so I would say gender stereotypes do make a difference, but they're not conclusive. We've lost you, Shamir.
Right. So maybe one last question, and then we'll go to the concluding part. Okay, so I'll ask maybe one last question. Forensic psychiatry, Dr. Muzaffar, is a very isolating field on its own. If you compare it with other disciplines of psychiatry, I mean, the experience of which I had of working in a rehab setting, I mean, those 6 months and 8 months, I mean, they were in this secluded unit, away from the rest of the fraternity, so as to say. Um, does that kind of like also becomes a challenge for people who are working in forensic psychiatry, especially when they are working with such complex pathologies that they somehow become distanced also from working in main hospital settings, for example, community mental health teams, for example, inpatient units, which are sort of like always housed under the same roof, because these are very peculiar sort of like setups, which are moved away from the main kind of like mainstream psychiatric setup. So I just wanted to ask you of your views about that.
I think what happens, if I can use a psychic defense mechanism, I think there is a terrible intolerance of these patients. You see, that's why these units are set up apart from all other units. But I think the way the forensic fraternity responds to that feeling of being ostracized is by idealizing it and feeling that you're better than everyone else, which is also terribly unhelpful. I think this kind of, but I will completely take your point, Shamil, that working with such complex patients, sexual pathology, homicidal pathology, um, it is disturbing. It is less frequent as well than what our mentally disordered patients do. It is less frequent. It's very, it's not that common. But when it does happen, it is so disturbing, and it's so societal intolerance is so excessive that you're the one who has to shoulder the burden of their treatment. Uh, but I'm not, so forensic services are staffed in the same way as other services. So we do have colleagues who we can lean on. And of course, balance groups, we have balance groups, in our setting where we have an opportunity to reflect on, but, sometimes we do repeat conflicts that our patients have, even within our teams. So that's why we need sort of these balance groups, because splitting dynamics. So there'll be rows between consultants, for example, or between the psychiatrist and the psychologist. That's the common row, you know. I think, but you need to be mindful of it.
Hmm. Right. I think we have run out of time. So we'll maybe use the last 10 minutes for some concluding remarks. Um, so this is the first in the series of talks as far as the Insight platform is concerned. So we hope to have another session in March or April, beginning of April. I just want to thank Dr. Muzaffar Hussain for taking the time out for this session, making himself available, as well as how you continue to invest, Muzaffar, in promoting the mental health agenda in Pakistan, despite your sort of like fluctuating presence here and there, but you still make sure that you make yourself available for all these activities. So thank you so much. And I really, really hope that this is just the beginning, and we would be able to sort of like foster a psychodynamic community, or maybe sort of facilitate the pathway for a psychodynamic community within our contextual kind of like settings as well. So on that note, I just wanted to ask everyone if they can actually switch on their cameras, because if you don't mind, we would like to take a picture so that we can actually share it on the digital media, the online media. And it's important just because we also need to establish some sort of a footprint for these activities. So I would really appreciate if you all can switch on your camera so that we can take a picture. Then there's a feedback form, and it's really important that you complete the feedback form, because if you don't give us your feedback, then we would not be in a position to further improvise these sessions. You may also want to come up with issues or subjects that you would like to explore from a psychodynamic lens. So the feedback form is pretty much open, so you can give us those suggestions as well. So let's open up our camera and then have a quick snapshot. I'll ask our administrator, Maria, to do that. Okay. Okay. So thank you, everyone. We'll meet, inshallah, again in March. Uh, the recording of the session will be made available on the Facebook, as well as hopefully on the YouTube platform. If you have any other questions, please do email us, and we'll put it through to Dr. Muzaffar. I know that we were crunched on time today, so we may not have had a chance to ask every other question, but please do fill in the feedback form. Thank you, Muzaffar. Thank you, Dr. Muzaffar, for this really, really helpful presentation.
Thank you
You
very
have
much,
kind of
everyone,
like
for listening.
been a hallmark of a new beginning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.